Chapter 3. Context. As well as understanding some of the terminology and culture, it's important to comprehend the historical background in which Gamergate existed, and that to which it was reacting. It is, after all, a combination of culture and context that best explains why this blew up, and nothing exists in a vacuum. Gamergate exists as only one of the latest in a long run of cases of resistance to interference in hobbies and pastimes. It does, however, have some differences to many of these classic cases, which also helps to explain why it became such a big cultural event, even more, as well as existing in an era of ubiquitous social media. Moral panics. A moral panic is, according to the Dictionary of Sociology, the process of arousing social concern over an issue, usually the work of moral entrepreneurs and the mass media. A moral entrepreneur being someone who wants to attempt to manipulate society and culture to create a new moral norm. Moral panics are often, however, spurious and even counterproductive. They are a form of hysteria that grabs the public consciousness to a large enough degree that commercial and state actors often feel like they have to intervene or make changes, even when these are unwarranted. What might be loosely termed geek media has a very long history of being demonized and hated. This occurs both through its incorporation of fringe material and its early adoption of disruptive technology. It also has a long tradition of resistance to moral busybodying, with limited success. I lived through the Satanic Panic, the PMRC's attempts to censor music, the Vampire Panic of the 90s, and several other smaller events. This has certainly coloured my views on the current social justice moral panic and the dangers it represents, even, or especially, because people are so convinced they're doing the right thing. Worthen and the Comics Code. In 1954, the psychiatrist Frederick Worthen published a book called Seduction of the Innocent. In it, he claimed that comic books were corrupting the youth and that they were a significant contributory cause of juvenile delinquency. The book was seized upon by parents, schools, and government, and the issue was whipped up into a frenzy of condemnation. Things rapidly got out of hand. They even got to the point where Worthen's scientifically unevidenced ideas gained enough currency and traction to be heard before the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency in 1954. Beyond this, there were problems outside the law as well. There were comics burnings, and more locally, city and state ordinances banned horror comics in particular. In a panicked response to this chain of events, and fearing truly draconian censorship legislation, the comics and magazine industry created their own voluntary code of self-censorship. This was the Comics Code, which was only truly abandoned in the 2000s. The code was ludicrous, and to modernize, rather quaint, as were similar codes such as the Hays Code for film. The Comics Code contained such gems as: policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions shall never be presented in such a way as to create disrespect for established authority. In every instance, good shall triumph over evil, and the criminal punished for his misdeeds. No comic magazine shall use the words horror or terror in its title. All lurid, unsavory, gruesome illustrations shall be eliminated. Inclusion of stories dealing with evil shall be used or shall be published only where the intent is to illustrate a moral scene dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead, torture, vampires and vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism and werewolfism are prohibited. Profanity, obscenity, smut, vulgarity, or words or symbols which have acquired undesirable meanings are forbidden. Suggestive and salacious illustration or suggestive posture is unacceptable. Females shall be drawn realistically without exaggeration of any physical qualities. One can certainly draw parallels between the Comics Code and many of the calls for censorship today. The UK government's list of banned acts in pornography, or their earlier list of controlled material, is not so very different and equally out of touch. The appeals for safety and control are now coming from social justice rather than right-wing Christian moralizing, but they're very similar. In a lesson for today's would-be censors, the Comics Code ushered in an age of rather staid and dull comics, as compared to the wildly experimental and challenging comics that had existed before. The trouble with censorship being that it is a blunt instrument that tends to take the good out of the marketplace along with the bad. Of course, an underground comic scene also blew up through the 60s and 70s, willfully and deliberately setting out to scandalise and to break every single commercial taboo of the comics code, as though it were a hit list. This remained mostly underground and an act of futile protest until the moral panic had passed, decades later. Still, there was resistance and a constant testing of the boundaries, even within commercial comics that signed up to the code. Britain didn't have the code, but barely had a home comics industry until later than the United States' Golden Age. Even so, a similar moral panic ended up killing off the rebellious and dangerous comic Action, but leading to the more acceptable science fiction comic 2000 AD, which still pushed boundaries and exists to this day. The Satanic Panic and BADD. The Satanic Panic was another moral panic that took true root primarily in America in the 1980s, before spreading internationally. It had started, as many of these panics do, with the publication of a book by Mike Warneke. This was a fantastical, tall tale about having been involved in satanic cults and rituals that was entirely fabricated. Nonetheless, he was accepted as an expert on Satanism and gained a lot of exposure on television and radio, picked up by evangelical Christian pastors and conservative politicians to further their own agendas. It didn't pick up steam, however, until the publication of another book, Michelle Remembers, by Michelle Smith. This was another pack of horrible-sounding lies, this time of ritual abuse that supposedly came out of repressed memories gathered by her psychiatrist, and later husband, Lawrence Pasder. As with Warneke's book, this was also given an enormous amount of credence by those who stood to benefit from it. This credence was completely out of step with the quality and amount of evidence for anything that was described in the book. There was no evidence whatsoever. Soon, empowered by the interest in and promulgation of the idea by the Christian right, along with the moral atmosphere of Reagan's America, people saw the influence of Satanism and the occult everywhere. They assumed the existence of a worldwide satanic conspiracy and saw its influence in everything from Ouija boards and tarot cards to games of Dungeons and Dragons and heavy metal music. Even barcodes. Meanwhile, a genuine global conspiracy of child molesters, the Catholic Church, was getting away with murder. The effect of this panic, for all that the ideas behind it were horseshit, was very real. As with the comic burnings, under Worthen's influence, people burned books, games, and albums. They destroyed their children's hobbies, ruined their childhoods, and destroyed their friendships in the name of protecting them. Ironically, they also ended up making D&D and heavy metal much cooler and more attractive. All this fear gave them an edge, and got a lot of kids interested in the forbidden fruit that was the occult. The reverberations of the Satanic Panic continue to this day, with each new fad being condemned as the work of the devil by some pastor or other trying to get some media currency and publicity. It no longer has the grip that it once did, and has broadly become the object of scorn. Everything from Harry Potter to Pokemon has been called satanic, and the song and dance is losing its allure. It may seem hard to believe now, but there was a time when this could genuinely cause problems. Of particular relevance to Gamergate is how the Satanic Panic played out in regard to role-playing games. Dungeons and Dragons had already been a cause of some concern to particular groups of parents. Children and adults playing Let's Pretend is such an intensive and structured thing that it seemed to cause a worry that some of the players would lose the ability to tell the difference between reality and fantasy. There were also concerns raised after some suicides were blamed on D&D, particularly by Pat Pulling, whose son had killed himself. Desperate for something, anything, to blame, she latched on to D&D and spent years smearing and slandering the game and its players. She founded BADD, Bad, bothered about Dungeons & Dragons to push her agenda, even producing materials for police forces relating to D&D and other role-playing games. In fact, studies showed that D&D players were better able to tell reality from fantasy, and had a suicide rate of 28 in 3 million. much less likely to kill themselves than the average. Did any of this matter? TSR, who owned D&D at the time, engaged in some mild self-censorship of nipples and changed some of the terminology and world building around their demon-inspired monsters. The Car PBG, Committee for the Advancement of Role-Playing Games, was set up as an advocacy and defence group. This didn't stop the book burnings and the bannings, the terrified parents doing the wrong thing. It made very little difference at all. The whole set of events would leave a long scar on the psyche of the geekosphere that is still felt to this day. This is like a race memory of just how far this nonsense can go and how bad it can be both for business and for the individual. As a teenage metalhead and RPG fan, I was up to my neck in the Satanic Panic. I made pamphlets in English class to educate about what the games were. I wrote letters to newspapers when I heard about a role-playing club being banned from meeting in a school or a scout hut. The internet wasn't a thing back then, but even so I campaigned hard on behalf of my hobbies against those who wanted to censor and control them. How could I do any different today? Unfortunately, the response of many people who lived through the same panics I had was to buy into the new moral panic. The very people who, of anyone, should know better, ended up helping perpetuate and worsen the current situation. They were also some of the leading figures to demonize Gamergate, even as it fought for their rights as creators. That was devastating. The PMRC. In 1985 we had another moral panic, one that coincided and overlapped with some of the Satanic Panic. This one was to do with music. The PMRC, Parents Music Resource Centre, co-founded by Tipper Gore, presaged that censorship would increasingly start to come from the left rather than the right, by taking up a crusade against violent, drug-related or sexual music. They believed, contrary to evidence as with previous moral panics, that music, most especially heavy metal and increasingly rap music, was a source of degeneracy with an adverse effect on the youth. To this end, they agitated for a rating system for music, for sexual or other controversial album covers to be hidden, for radio stations to censor certain songs, and for music to be labelled if it contained explicit lyrics. As with previous moral panics, the music industry put up a strong defence, and made a few largely meaningless concessions to try and stave off full censorship. Artists as diverse as Dee Snider, John Denver and Frank Zappa testified before the committee and made rousing defences of artistic free expression that were inspiring to see. In the end, the PMRC made little change to anything other than the adoption of the parental advisory explicit lyrics label, which, in the end, probably sold more albums and made those slapped with the label richer. Nonetheless, the defence that artists and the music industry made of their creativity is noteworthy, for later contrast with issues around Gamergate, when games were attacked, in no small part, by its own internal quislings. The PMRC issue, of course, didn't much affect the UK directly. The discussion wasn't had here, and we'd already had many of the same debates in the punk era. Our radio was already heavily redacted and censored. Heavy metal did, however, come in for some softened blowback. Metal, along with other things I was into, a casual interest in the occult and a love of role-playing games, were the subject of scaremongering by religious groups that came into schools. There was a video we were forced to watch in religious education class called Doorways to Danger, that went into great, panicked detail over how terrible and satanic all these things were. Fortunately, our RE teacher joined in our mockery and abuse of the poor guitar-wielding hip Christian who presented this rubbish to us, and he was sent packing. Jack Thompson. Jack Thompson is a disbarred attorney from Florida in the United States. He has a long history of riding the coattails of moral outrages, from radio obscenity fines to rap music, and finally, most famously, video games. He hit his stride in video games, coinciding with a growing moral panic about violence in games, as they began to get more photorealistic, three-dimensional, and immersive. It can seem silly looking back at these older games, but the blood and gore of Mortal Kombat and the shift to a first-person view in games like Doom were a sea change, especially with the advent of widespread home consoles. As with many of the previous moral panics, his concerns were over the dangers to the youth. He called games such as Grand Theft Auto murder simulators, and took part in blaming them for violence and shootings, even suggesting that their mind-bending properties could constitute a defense in court. These cases and Thompson's claims coincided with a series of high-profile school shootings, such as the Columbine massacre. Looking back now, many of his claims, such as that the PlayStation 2's force feedback was psychological conditioning, are ridiculous. But society was looking for something to blame, and games seemed to fit the bill. More importantly, having something to blame absolved parents, teachers, schoolmates, and the system of any responsibility. As with other moral panics, the industry and its fans did not react well to attacks on their passion. Thompson became the subject of ridicule and found himself coded or patched or made into games where you could beat him up, kill him, and otherwise burn him in effigy. Interestingly, this passed largely without comment, unlike the Punch Anita Flash game, which was considered so terrible. There are also Punch Trump games now that similarly pass without fuss. Games were even created based on his peculiar ideas of what games were, or what the worst possible game could be. Industry and fans were united against him, and yet again, there was, and there remains, no evidence that games increase violent behaviour. If anything, the opposite. Despite this lack of scientific support, games have been censored, and various degrees of state control or voluntary rating have been brought in. In the USA, since 1994, the Entertainment Software Ratings Board has applied ratings to games. While this doesn't seem to have stopped underage kids playing games, it does, at least in the USA, appear to have warded off the worst of the censorship. Other nations with less robust free speech laws have not fared as well, with Germany and Australia being particularly severe cases for game censorship. It's worth pointing out, yet again, that in the instance of Thompson and the school shooting panic, the games industry and its fans were united in the face of that panic. They fought together, games media fans and games companies, as one, to mock and challenge the threat. This wouldn't happen with Gamergate. As with other panics, the fuss over violence in games only made them more appealing. I remember being desperate to play Mortal Kombat and to learn all of the kill moves. Crude as they were, the fuss about them made doing so much more appealing and much more valuable. In the event of playing the game, it was a disappointment, but the challenge of finding someone who was allowed to have a copy, even at age 16, added the thrill the game itself lacked. The Streisand effect was a thing long before the internet christened it in 2003. The porn panic. Panic over pornography is nothing new. It's as old as pornography itself, at least in the modern sense. Even nations with enshrined free expression laws such as the United States have grappled with the issue. They have enacted laws and regulations, or tried to, that have interfered with the free production and consumption of adult material at both the state and federal level. In the United Kingdom, access to hardcore pornography was barely possible until the advent of pirated satellite television, and then the internet, back in the 1990s. The internet made local restriction impossible, pointless, like trying to stop beamed propaganda radio across the Iron Curtain. Since then, there has been an increasingly harsh pushback via various nefarious means. This has not only occurred in the USA via Operation Chokepoint, an initiative intended to target grey or black market operations, but increasingly used to target pornographers, but also in the UK via a most peculiar alliance: radical feminism in the form of sex-negative feminist Gail Dines, and traditionalist conservatism in the shape of David Cameron and the UK Conservative Party cooperated. Together, they laid the groundwork for the Digital Economy Bill, which has already had massive impact on the small, and ironically female-led, UK porn industry. This has had a massively deleterious effect, especially on marginalised kink porn and feminist porn producers such as Pandora Blake. The agenda apparently overrides sisterhood, and repression overrides progress, at least if you happen to want the wrong kind of liberalisation. The tactics employed both sides of the Atlantic also amply demonstrate that the combination and interactions of private and financial censorship and activist influence on government control can be almost as devastating as outright bans and government interference alone. Activists now wield an enormous amount of power, particularly in the private sphere, and often end up harming the very causes of diversity, feminism, etc. that they claim to champion. At least they end up harming the wrong kind of diversity, feminism, and progressivism from their point of view. If you want to learn more about pornography, society, and censorship issues, I recommend Freakonomics, A Billion Wicked Thoughts, and Porn Panic, Sex and Censorship in the UK for further reading. A too much information moment for you. I grew up before the porn liberalisation that the internet allowed. The internet didn't become a proper thing until 1995 when I was already 20. Our sex education up until then primarily came from awkward school lessons or stumbling on someone's discarded softcore porn stash in the woods. People decry pornography as a place to learn about sex, but it's a damn sight better than the older alternatives. I grew up kinky without really understanding or realising what that was. There was no internet, no way to connect to that community. This is in some ways much like I imagine growing up isolated as an LGBT alphabet soup person must be, though not as serious. I grew up without the faintest idea that there was a whole BDSM community, and very confused and self-loathing about the nature of my desires. It wasn't until being gifted a set of John Norman's Gore novels that I realised that this was a thing, that I wasn't some monster. The internet later helped, but I never really got over that. I'm glad kids growing up today have, at least for the time being, a way to self-explore their sexuality and to find communities that accept them, whatever they are. The flip side of this, of course, is that people with genuinely horrific beliefs and practices can also form mutually supporting and reinforcing communities. Paedophiles, for example, often create rings and communities online. That may worsen their behaviour, and which has led to something of a movement for paedophile acceptance, which is extremely worrying. YouTube. As I'm writing this, there is a new moral panic, which I am tangentially caught up in. This one is an almost perfect example of the problems involved in irresponsible and unethical media, commercial censorship, and moral panics, all of which are relevant to and legacy of Gamergate's concerns. YouTube has been a fantastic platform for creatives for many years, a relatively unfiltered, uncensored, meritocratic base upon which people could build careers and earn money for their commentary, art, and alternative media. That seems to have, at least for now, to have somewhat come to an end. The gold rush, at least, is over. The Wall Street Journal started this panic in the wake of the US elections, in which alternative media and problems with mainstream media played a significant role. They wrote a series of articles decrying YouTube's monetization of extreme and hateful content. What happened, of course, is that a few minor videos and channels that were barely a blip had escaped YouTube's algorithms. As a result, they had been monetized while having sensitive and non-PC content or titles, some of it legitimately hateful, much of it not. Adverts are also placed algorithmically without human intervention and have little or nothing to do with the content of any of video that they appear alongside, especially when it comes to mass-market brands. The media, however, starting with the Wall Street Journal and including others, presented this as though YouTube and the advertisers involved were endorsing or funding hate speech and extremist views. In a knee-jerk response, many advertisers pulled their funding from YouTube, sucking money out of the platform and causing YouTube, in turn, to make a panicked, knee-jerk response of their own. Many YouTubers were doubly hit by this panic. The removal of a great deal of advertising revenue from the platform hit their income by as much as 95%. Then they were hit as YouTube's panicked doubling of control and censorship meant many more of their videos, especially in terms of commentary on news and politics, were denied any advertising revenue at all. For people who had built this into a career and were creating content on YouTube full-time, this was devastating. With similar irony to that found in the feminist-motivated censorship of pornography in the UK, these tightened constrictions hit liberal outlets hard. Channels like The David Pakman Show, which reported the news and right-wing views in order to criticize them, for example. Even LGBT channels were hit, the panic allowing advertisers to dictate to the platform about anything socially uncomfortable. This went well beyond the demanded degree of censorship. but this is what always happens. This attack in itself came in the wake of attacks on prominent YouTuber PewDiePie, not the only target, over off-colour jokes and comedic and ironic references to Nazism in their videos. This, similarly, was an example of media irresponsibility and narrative framing to present the situation in a far different light to its actual nature. Speaking for myself, I have a YouTube channel where I talk about many things, including political and social commentary. In the wake of these controversies, I have found that many more of my videos, especially about current affairs, have been demonetized, and my advertising rate has declined. I doubled the size of my channel over the last year. My traffic is up proportionally, but my YouTube income has decreased slightly. Whenever I comment on something like the Islamist terror attacks in London, they are inevitably demonetized and get a fraction of the hits that they would have done before. This is hugely discouraging to many channels, which, entirely respectfully, talk about and examine current affairs. I think that's a dangerous discouragement to the provision of multiple sources and points of view, and it continues to rip the guts out of alternative media and to force them to shift their business models in unpredictable ways. The new moral panic. Gamergate itself is only one part of an extensive and ongoing moral panic that dates back at least to 2012 in some forms and likely stretches back much further in others. It is reminiscent of the height of the previous political correctness overreach in the 1990s, which far outstripped sensible concerns and accommodations and began to interfere with language, expression, and conduct before being rebuffed and defeated. It's hard to describe this new moral panic efficiently and simply, other than perhaps political correctness gone mad, which unfortunately is something of a dismissive trope or meme when phrased that way. Perhaps another way to describe it would be the curse of intersectionality. What its root appears to be is that large numbers of well-meaning but unthinking people, empowered by social media, heads filled with peculiar and self-contradicting ideology, have self-selected themselves to be the moral arbiters and censors of all culture. They demand an absolute adherence to an ever-shifting and never-satisfied moral purity in language, expression, politics, art, teaching, and more. They form online and increasingly offline mobs to enforce this moral orthodoxy. They claim to be liberal, while being starkly small c conservative, especially around sex and art. They claim to be critics, while being censors. They claim to be for free speech, while shutting down and censoring speech and expression. They claim speech is violence, and that this is unacceptable, while using violence to shut down speech. They claim to be feminist, while supporting genuinely patriarchal Islamic religion against criticism and invoking Islamophobia. Everything is racist, everything is sexist, everything is homophobic, and you have to point it all out. Anita Sarkeesian. This phenomenon, these people, have come to be known as social justice warriors, or, for the more academically inclined, the regressive left, which better describes the inherent hypocrisy of the position. You could call this an intersectional moral panic. It has remarkable endurance and an almost amorphous quality, sharing many of the same actors, even as it strays from topic to topic. I've been on the receiving end of it, and as such a victim of many of the things the social justice warriors complain about or play themselves up as victims of. Threats of violence, blacklisting, disinvitation, rape threats, hate mail, boycotts, hacking attempts, you name it. Oh, but it's okay when they do it. A quick note about censorship. American readers may object to the usage of the term censorship when referring to social censure or private companies controlling content. It's important to recognize that this is a rather parochial, insular, legalistic, and narrow definition of the principle of free expression. Anything that suppresses and controls speech or expression is censorship. It doesn't have to be governmental. The real question is whether you think such suppression is justified or excusable. Few of us would probably argue that photographic child pornography shouldn't be controlled or banned. Some of us may change our minds when it comes to lolicon or shota artwork, Japanese underage pornographic comics, which has been protected by the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund in the past. Our position will also be informed by the ages of consent in our home cultures. Different standards, different contexts, different lines drawn for censorship. The public square is increasingly in private hands. It is controlled by a number of commercial choke points regarding social media and sales points. Amazon, for example, downlists and deprioritizes self-published works, especially erotica. This means that independent and smut authors have a hard time competing on an equal playing field. Producers of adult content also often find themselves paying premiums on payment processing, and even being barred from services such as PayPal. This is a misuse of Operation Chokepoint again. It may be necessary soon to assert the human right to free expression over private companies in the same way that LGBT and racial minority rights have been asserted over bakers, bars, diners and cafes in the past. Without going to the Supreme Court in the USA soon, this may present a precedent for the extension of civil rights into the private sphere on a larger scale. I rather hope so. For my part, I am fairly close to a free speech absolutist, so far as pragmatism allows. To my mind, the only valid excuse for censorship is if that expression meets the harm principle, something that's nearly impossible for mere speech. The harm principle, as formulated by John Stuart Mill, is the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. It shouldn't need clarifying, but it is current year, so unfortunately we have to. When we talk about harm here, we're not talking about hurt feelings, or feelings at all. What would meet the harm principle regarding speech? Would be direct cause for violence? I hate white people wouldn't meet it. Kill whitey would. Context, of course, also plays a role. Things are excusable in comedy, for example, that aren't when said with sincerity and genuine intent. Having been a repeated victim of private censorship has no doubt shaped my view, and I do not claim in any way on this topic to be unbiased. Occupy Wall Street. Perhaps the first huge sign that something was going wrong emerged during Occupy Wall Street. The factors that contributed to its collapse as a useful and meaningful movement are obvious in retrospect. What had begun as an incredibly broad-based and unifying cause against corporate and moneyed influence on government ended up as a divided and sectarian laughingstock. The problem then, as now, though for different reasons, was intersectionality. Intersectionality is a concept often used in critical theories to describe the ways in which oppressive institutions, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, xenophobia, classism, etc., are interconnected and cannot be examined separately from one another. Geek Feminism Wiki. In theory, that can sound like a good idea. After all, yes, these things can and do stack up. In practice, it tends to create a sprawling orthodoxy where the perfect is the enemy of the good, and where nobody can sufficiently agree on a singular cause long enough to get anything done. Sometimes these aims even become contradictory. It has also led to a rather regressive inversion of the presumed normal social hierarchy. In this version, priority is given to the most oppressed and most marginalized person, in the form of the progressive stack. This is a form of oppression Olympics that forces people to exaggerate and even fabricate their identities and forms of oppression so that they can speak up at meetings and be taken seriously in a broader context. If you ever wondered why so many people seem to preface anything they say with a laundry list of race, gender, sexuality, mental illness, etc., now you know why. They're seeking both permission to speak and power from victimhood. Intersectionality killed Occupy by dividing and subdividing that initial broad-based citizen uprising until all that was left were the true crazies. What was left was incapable of compromise, and only the most pure regarding social justice credentials that were left. A handful of the worst of the worst. I best saw this explained on a YouTube video closer to the time that I have since been unable to find. Imagine a whiteboard, clean and pristine, gleaming white. Now picture drawing a circle on that board, as large as it will allow, and label this one Money in Politics. That's about as large and inclusive as Occupy ever got to be. Everyone who agreed on that singular issue. That issue took in many conservatives, a ton of libertarians, masses of socialists, and many ordinary folks concerned with the way politics was going. Now draw a slightly smaller circle, barely any smaller, and label that corporate personhood. Most people still agreed on that, but you might have lost a few of the more extreme libertarians and Rand fans who were concerned by corporatism, but who saw money as speech as fine. Now draw a more significantly small circle within that one, down and to the right a little. Label that one wealth inequality. You're probably losing more capitalism fans by this point, a lot of the libertarians too, and a lot of regular folks, no matter how good the arguments might be. Now another, smaller circle, within the last one. Mark that wealth redistribution. This occurs already, of course, but many people associate it with socialism, communism, and other associated terms have negative connotations, especially in the USA, wildly beyond what they deserve, but there you go. You can already see how the size of the movement is shrinking away, and this is just sticking to directly related issues. Try drawing a much smaller circle and label this one rape culture. This is an unrelated, radical feminist narrative that the remaining, somewhat reasonable people are unlikely to go along with as a concept. What about forgiving all debt? A rather extreme demand. What about asking for racial gender equality amendments, unnecessary as said rights are already guaranteed? How many people from that original big circle are going to be left at this point? How many people are going to agree with everything in all of those circles? Occupy showed how the left could eat itself, alienate liberals who would otherwise agree with many of the professed aims, and it showed just how harmful pseudo-left, pseudo-academic discourse and weird identity politics could be to genuine causes. Many of Occupy's concerns and practices were so extreme, so unrelated, so obscure, so laughable, that they harmed the central movement. We saw a shift, though, and mere ridiculousness wouldn't be enough to disarm this kind of thing for long. Atheism Plus. An immediate precursor to Gamergate and sharing many factors with it, Atheism Plus was an attempt to stage a coup of sorts within the new atheism movement. This was a split that was, in many ways, between the skeptic atheists, rooted in a tradition of science and skepticism, and the political atheists. That second group's reasoning appeared to come more from opposition to the Christian right on an ideological level, rather than a basis of logic, reason, and commitment to the intellectual pursuit of truth. Supposedly, it was about Atheism Plus dealing with a bunch of other things, initially proposed by a blogger, Jen McCrate. It suggested that atheist activism should also apply itself to feminism, social justice, racism, homophobia, and so forth. Unfortunately, it forgot to implement the foundational skepticism and critical thinking inherent to much of the new atheist movement, to its sacred cows. As leading figures like Rebecca Watson, P.Z. Myers, and more embraced it and began making intellectually weak social justice arguments and attacking fellow skeptics, those professed beliefs came under scrutiny. They were weighed, measured, and found wanting. The Atheism Plus people found their ideas being considered with the same attention to detail that atheists and skeptics had previously turned on religious beliefs, pseudoscience, and alternative medicine. They didn't like this much. Social science is barely science in the minds of many. Its relative lack of rigor, its lack of reproducibility, its vulnerability to hoaxes, and its hostility to peer review make it a joke amongst those involved in the hard sciences. All of this is doubly true for gender studies and similar disciplines that wear their biases on their sleeve. This isn't to say that all social science is garbage, but it does appear to be deeply compromised and infected with ideological bias and postmodernism. Little wonder that people who weren't impressed by the Creation Institute have not been impressed by the pseudo-scientific end of these disciplines, even when they've been embraced by people who call themselves skeptics, albeit selective ones. Of course, that skepticism, that questioning, has in turn caused the other side to double down to accuse any who disagree of misogyny, racism, or whatever other accusation du jour seems appropriate. This has created an enormous fracture within that skeptic/atheist community, which will likely never be healed. Much of what happened in Gamergate is similar. People skeptical of the sexism, racism, and mind control claims made of video games were accused of all manner of horrible things simply for asking for evidence. It's also similar in that with both Atheism Plus and Gamergate, the problem started with people from within rather than without. A break in the tradition of most moral panics, which are usually attacks by external enemies. I have been an atheist since I was old enough to realise that Father Christmas wasn't a real thing, and I was able to draw the obvious parallel between the one and the other. The skeptic and atheist communities had been as much of a haven as gaming for me, a place to meet like-minded people and to continually learn. To see this fringe group of crazy people, operating as much on faith as any religion, break up what had been a consistent and growing movement since 2001 was frankly heartbreaking. It made me a hell of a lot more cynical and suspicious of people's motives in a way that I doubt will ever change back. Anita Sarkeesian. Any discussion of the lead up to Gamergate that doesn't mention Anita Sarkeesian would be incomplete. In many ways, she, and her fating by the game's media, set the fertile ground from which Gamergate would sprout. Sarkeesian began her Feminist Frequency project in 2009, a feminist critique of popular media of various kinds. It wasn't too popular and came in for a little criticism and counter-accusations against that criticism, but failed to get any real traction until she put video games in her sights. In 2012, she launched a Kickstarter campaign for her series Tropes vs. Women in Video Games, which received an enormous amount of media attention, especially from the desperately virtue-signalling games media. Gamers themselves were, however, not impressed. Alarm bells of a Jack Thompson-esque nature were ringing. Many of the kinds of claims she appeared to be making about the alleged sexism, racism, etc. of games didn't ring true. She seemed to have a profound ignorance of the history of games, their audiences, or the lore that she was criticizing. These counter-criticisms, along with some inevitable trolling, were characterized as misogynistic abuse, and also given enormous media exposure, priming the pump for gamer resentment towards their news outlets and distrust of the narratives that they presented. Off the back of this victim-based publicity, the Kickstarter was massively oversubscribed, and yet, despite that, the series only just finished off in 2017, many years late, and short of its original aims. The production of Tropes vs. Women in Video Games caused a lot of gamers to start digging away, trying to figure out what was going on, especially as the project ran behind and episode after episode betrayed a near-total ignorance of the source material, as well as writing her enormous ideological bias so large it could be seen from space. In relatively short order, links were found between Sarkeesian and dubious internet marketing scams. She was exposed as lying about her gamer cred, she was found to be stealing art and footage, and she was found to be misrepresenting what was happening in the games that she critiqued. None of this seemed to have any impact on her credibility in feminist or media circles, but it was a death blow so far as gamers were concerned. They began to become more and more confused and betrayed by the fact that the games media and some companies were giving this obvious-seeming fraud the time of day. Despite this, few games media outlets took any of this seriously. Instead, they decided to focus on the harassment narrative. There's little doubt that Sarkeesian did receive some harassment, but in the immortal words of Tyler the Creator, "Ha ha 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 ha, how the fuck is cyberbullying real? Ha ha ha, nigger, just walk away from the screen, like, nigger, close your eyes, ha ha ha." Tyler the Creator, on Twitter, retweeted and liked well over 300,000 times. There was a bigger problem than some blockable trolls attacking someone who had advertised their vulnerabilities. That problem was that the genuine criticisms and warnings about her ended up being treated as though they were harassment. Any critique of Sarkeesian or her later imitators was met with accusations of misogyny, harassment, bullying, and so forth. Intentionally or not, Sarkeesian had also proven the financial viability of a new form of business: monetized victimhood. I had initially thought Sarkeesian was a slightly dishonest critic, shifting things to suit her agenda. Her total unwillingness to discuss, debate, or address any questions has hardened my attitude towards her, though. Her use of spurious abuse to advocate for internet censorship is dangerous, whether it's ignorant or not, and she fits into a long tradition of critics seeking to control subcultural media. This was compounded for me recently when she was present at a YouTube-oriented convention called VidCon. While there, she was on 2 panels. From the first, she abused one of her critics who was sitting in the audience. In the second, she attacked and abused a YouTuber by the name of Boogie2988, one of the loveliest people in the online famous space, and a genuine victim of real and horrific harassment himself. Any lingering sympathy or understanding for Sarkeesian I might have had vanished over that weekend, especially with other similar feminist and sockjus online personalities finally reaching out to discuss and debate. Side note: synergistic trolling. Anyone who has spent any amount of time on the internet knows that the standard wisdom when being trolled or anonymously harassed is to ignore it. Don't feed the trolls. This is and remains sound advice. It's the only way to retain a free internet and to deal with its more noxious elements effectively. Some threats and actions are of course more serious and deserve to be taken seriously. The posting of Navy SEAL memes and anonymous threats of various kinds are, however, safe to ignore and are usually blatantly, obviously trolling. Despite this, some people continue to take them seriously, despite them being obviously spurious within an instant or so to anyone with a modicum of internet experience. This rather requires us to ask, why? In my estimation, from what I've observed, this is a phenomenon that I call synergistic trolling. What this means is that where don't feed the troll generally works, it assumes that the victim of the trolling finds the attacks annoying and wants to break the cycle. Trolls desire feedback and infamy. Denying them attention and exposure prevents them from getting the pleasure that they seek. Where this goes wrong is where the person being trolled is also served and validated by the trolling. This has been particularly visible from feminist blogs and articles. They often post rather petty bait articles about things like manspreading or beating up their boyfriends. This in turn attracts a reaction from trolls and critics who then get conflated and used to fuel the harassment and sexism narrative. The troll gets the reaction and publicity that they want. The trollee gets the reaction and publicity and money that they want. Everyone is a winner, and yet at the same time, everyone is a loser, since taking trolling seriously fuels censorship and control demands over the internet. Perhaps the starkest embodiment of this abject stupidity is Lewis's law. The comments on any article about feminism justify feminism. Helen Lewis, New Statesman / Guardian, etc., stated on Twitter. The tautological, circular nature of this statement should be obvious. It can be applied to any extreme and ideological position that causes a reaction. The comments on any article about white supremacy justify white supremacy, for example. It's worthless, meaningless, not even slightly intelligent, but it does indicate how fishing for a reaction can be rewarding for the targeted party. Genuine critics, such as myself, are left in something of a bind. Do we leave the bait alone and thereby leave it unchallenged to be taken as true? Do we take the bait and take it apart, knowing we'll be conflated with the inevitable trolls and be ignored and have our reputations trashed? There is no way to win. Entitled gamers. Gamers are demanding, with little tolerance for bullshit. Games are expensive. The hype around games promises a lot, and if a game fails to deliver on its promises, woe betide the developer who let down their audience. There had been rumblings about entitled gamers for some time, and a similar harassment narrative as that found around female and minority critics, no matter how shitty they were as people. It really blew up over the ending of Mass Effect 3. Gamers adored Mass Effect. It was a sprawling science fiction epic that had the whole galaxy in peril. It had engaging characters, a 1970s/80s NASA art aesthetic, and an involving storyline so good that people forgave many of its gameplay quirks and variations. It was also much more consistent than Dragon Age, its fantasy counterpart, and its fans became heavily, emotionally invested. The big buy-in came about because this was a game in which your decisions were supposed to matter. Your progress saves from Game 1 would carry over into Game 2 and on into Game 3. They would inform the way interactions unfurled, and the way the conflicts and nature of the galaxy were presented. All of this promised that every decision you made would accumulate from game to game, all the way through to the climax at the very end. Every person you saved, every critical decision you made, would all result in a personalized and meaningful outcome. When Mass Effect 3 dropped, the climax to the series, the fans were pumped, engaged, ready for the payoff from years of gameplaying and speculation. People were rabidly enthusiastic to get to that long-promised ending. It was a damp squib. Everything you had done boiled down to a couple of seconds here or there in a pre-rendered cutscene. No matter what you had done, your final decision came down to walking through one of 3 doors. Completely unaffected by 3 games of obsessive play, weighing every single action and treating it as though it had consequence. Gamers were pissed. They had sunk around $200 or so, including downloadable content, into the series, had been promised the moon on a stick, and had been delivered a simple trinary choice, in which all that investment was completely irrelevant. In that instance, I think the reaction was more than justified. If you paid $200 for a meal and were promised a Michelin star lemon sorbet for dessert, only to be served a tiny sliver of stale coffee cake, I think you'd be rightly angry. We would not call such a diner entitled for demanding what they were promised, especially at that price. Still, this, in 2012, was a part of the media souring on the hardcore gamer who had been their bread and butter for years. It fed into swelling gamer resentment and suspicion of their fan media. These were the outlets that should have, at least broadly, shared their view. These were the outlets that were supposed to be their consumer champions. Instead, they were attacking their audience. And this was the shape of things to come. Cancel Colbert. In March of 2014, a scant few months before Gamergate would start, there was another key precursor event. This was probably the last time people would openly laugh and scorn the absurdity of social justice, before it seemed to become something more serious and dangerous. Stephen Colbert did a skit on his show, making fun of the desperate and sad efforts of the Washington Redskins to counter the arguably racist connotations of their name. In the skit, he lampooned this with the following: "I am willing to show the Asian community I care by introducing the Ching Chong Ding Dong Foundation for Sensitivity to Orientals," or whatever. To any sane or rational person, it was evident that this was using and subverting the language of racism towards Asian people to satirize the attitudes and actions of the management of the Washington Redskins. To self-styled activist Sui Park, though, this was in and of itself inexcusable racism. She took to Twitter, as such people are wont to do, to whip up a mob. Cancel Colbert, because white liberals are just as complicit in making Asian Americans into punchlines and we aren't amused. Sui Park, March 27th, 2014. Reaction to this was mixed, rather than the unified front we would later come to expect from progressive outlets. Some backed Sui Park, some backed Colbert. Colbert's liberal credentials were unimpeachable, which helped him. Most people understood the point of the joke. Calling a satire on blundering racism racist was obvious enough that many were left scratching their heads as to what all the fuss was about. What made Sui Park a figure of internet fun, however, was her car crash interview with Josh Zepp on the Huffington Post. She was evasive, racist towards the host, and crashed out of the interview with the immortal catchphrase, "I don't think I'm going to enact the labour of having to explain to you why that's incredibly offensive." Because if there's one thing activists shouldn't be doing, it's trying to explain to people why they're upset, or what the problem is. They're just supposed to know magically, somehow. Sui became a figure of fun for a short while, occasionally resurfacing briefly before fading into relative obscurity. Still, she established a brand of humorlessness and hypersensitivity that would characterize the social justice warriors in the coming conflict. Women in tech. Gamergate emerged in the middle of a set of ongoing discussions around feminism, women in STEM, science, technology, engineering and maths, and the supposedly hostile and anti-woman atmosphere found in tech industries. There are endless arguments back and forth over whether there is a pay gap and to what degree nature and nurture play a part in career choice. The blame has mostly been put squarely on a presumptively misogynistic tech industry. Considerable efforts have been made at great cost to get more women into STEM degrees and fields, but with little overall success. whatever you think the reason might be. That a male-dominated industry tends to have a male-dominated culture seems to A. surprise people and B. shock them. Why is impossible to discern. Why the same observations are not made about feminized, female-oriented workplace is also impossible to discern. There have been endless stories about addressing this issue, finding things to blame and telling women how sexist these industries are, because apparently that will encourage them to join these industries. There is a narrative being pushed, and the truth of the matter be damned. This type of story is repeated over and over, not only on sites like Jezebel with an overtly feminist agenda, but in otherwise creditable news outlets such as The Guardian. This atmosphere already existed with anecdotal tales of harassment and sexism long before Gamergate was a dot on the horizon. For the most part, like a lot of supposedly sexist issues, this seems to come down to personal choice. For whatever reason, men and women, as broad demographics, appear to choose different kinds of career. This holds true, and even is expressed more strongly, in nations with high measured levels of gender equality. Nobody should be held back from going into whatever career they want, but equally they shouldn't be forced to go into a career they have no interest in. This goes for both men and women. Online bullying and harassment. Another strand that has been a constant background hum before, during and after Gamergate has been the intimidation and harassment narrative. This has been interpreted as a female problem, despite ample evidence from many sources, including anti-bullying charities, demonstrating that men are the majority of victims of online harassment. What seems to differ are the reactions of women to being harassed, the kind of harassment that they get, and the reaction that we as a society have when women are harassed. In practice, this amounts to a sexist double standard, one which has been explored in various studies. As one example, it turns out that removing benevolent sexism is seen as sexist. It seems the more effort you put into treating women and other minorities equally, the more bigoted people will think you are. All rather self-defeating. There are other strange aspects to the way this is reported on. There tends to be a conflation of issues, such as considering stalking to be online harassment rather than its own thing. Many treat harmless online smack talk with the same gravitas as genuine cyberbullying. Many of the biggest victims of trolling are archly feminist article writers for online news outlets, who all but advertise their buttons and invite trolls to push them, then make hay from being trolled. Harassment then becomes a concern for female column writers, who then write more about it, inviting more trolls, and so on, into a vicious cycle. Mere disagreement, particularly with someone from a protected class, becomes spun and rebranded as harassment to avoid criticism. Even pointing out someone's genuinely wrong actions can sometimes be brushed aside if a harassment narrative can be created around them, protecting them from fallout from their bad behaviour. It seems suspicious that governments are latching onto these arguments and using them to make a case for more controls and less anonymity online, even though trolls, when unmasked, most often turn out to be harmless, pathetic, and their threats less than credible. The knock-on effect to political and religious dissidents, domestic abuse victims, LGBT youth and so on from the loss of internet anonymity and freedom would be terrifying, even deadly. These consequences have already happened to some degree via Facebook and Google Plus's real names policies. Ignorable but nasty trolling may very well be the price that we pay for some of the good things the internet gives us. We must be free to disagree, even with vitriol, without being arrested over our disagreements. I know personally all ends of trolling and online abuse. Being a cis-het white male didn't insulate me. Indeed, it made me more of a target. I was targeted for advocating against censorship and for creative freedom. Many of the people who have attacked me haven't been ignorable anonymous trolls, but individuals with names, faces, and audiences, even Will Wheaton. There is a marked and discernible difference between anonymous trolls fishing for a reaction and genuine abuse from people in positions of power. As a victim myself, I'm sick of people trying to make political mileage by misrepresenting what has happened to them. It needs to stop. Existing corruption issues. Games media has long had a problem with corruption and ethical issues. Gamergate was just, perhaps, one of the more visible explosions of these issues, but they've been around in the background for many years. Going back to the early days of video games journalism, games magazines such as Nintendo Power were owned and operated by games companies themselves. This was, of course, fairly obvious. What you read in those magazines could be taken with a grain of salt, in the upfront knowledge that it would be hideously biased. The industry was also smaller at that time, and the corruption had less of a consequence. Things were not, yet, as serious. In many ways, this corruption was simply taken as being part of the lay of the land. People were used to it, grumbled, but put up with it, forewarned and forearmed against it. Things began to get more serious as the games industry began to explode in popularity and worth. Games reviews began to shift online, and to an advertising rather than a subscription or sales revenue model. This has given advertisers and sponsors an enormous amount of power over games media outlets through their direct or indirect sponsorships. Another aspect of this is that those outlets rely on access to games to write their stories, get clicks, and hence advertising revenue. To get early access, to get early release copies of games, to make reviews and guides and so on, they need to maintain a good relationship with the game studios. Bad reviews risk losing revenue and access. This is part of the reason why an average score for a game is 7 out of 10 rather than 5. I've personally seen this happen. A friend of mine used to review MMORPGs for a website. When they gave a particular game a poor review, they received a lot of pushback from their editor, a near refusal to publish it, an enormous amount of attention and pressure from the studio involved, and a lot more. In the end, they relented and upped the score a little, but it left a bad taste in their mouth, and they stopped working for the site shortly thereafter. A higher profile example of the same problem came with Gerstmann-gate. In this instance, a writer for GameSpot gave the game Kane and Lynch a poor review, a 6, which in any sane world would be considered above average. The problem was that Kane and Lynch was being advertised heavily on the site at the time, so the poor review looked especially bad. As a result, Gerstmann was fired, and it took 5 years for the other details to come out, including suggestions that other companies were applying similar financial pressure to games review sites. Interestingly, many game sites that have run stories on this, and how bad it is, were happy to gloss over or ignore the issues around Gamergate. Also interestingly, Gamergate have supported studio boycotts of media outlets they felt betrayed by. A genuine example, perhaps, of a double standard, if understandable. These problems, and Gamergate, have led a lot of gamers to an exodus away from the larger game sites, seeking out those who promise a more ethical and honest approach. This also drove a lot of people to YouTubers, who were more separated from games advertisers. As YouTube became more popular, the same corruption issues began to appear there. With YouTube's old advertising model being undermined and YouTubers needing to look elsewhere for revenue, this is only likely to get worse, and smaller websites have a hard time becoming self-sufficient too. The indie scene. Corruption and grubbiness was the status quo when it came to the big games companies and the media, but there was a new movement of independent and small-scale games production that promised to be something different. To start with, indie just meant independent. That was down to small companies and individual game creators selling their material online themselves or via Steam and other marketplaces. Many also gave their games away for free. This was possibly the biggest and most exciting change in games development since the bedroom programmer era of the ZX Spectrum and Commodore 64, or the shareware and demo scene of the 16-bit era. Inevitably, the indie games scene began to become political, just as independent publishing and music had. Rather than meaning independent, indie started to mean progressive or right on, sometimes to an absurd degree. The games media, populated with frustrated people who wanted to be real writers and wanted what they did to mean something, to them this was a godsend. Suddenly game sites were flush with politicized game reporting, and this began to bleed into reviews of mainstream games. Suddenly points were being lost for sexualized design or failure to include minorities. Gamers, who mainly didn't care or at least didn't think this was the most important thing, were left asking an important question. Yeah, okay, but is the game any good? Indie games were being treated like the second coming. Their creators were being held up as moral paragons. All the while, more and more coverage was being given to non-games. Regular games were at the same time being judged on increasingly esoteric and politicized standards. Any challenge or question to this emerging order was, of course, dismissed as bigotry. Gamers began to build up a steam of resentment and annoyance at being talked down to, told off, judged, and not being told what they needed to know, whether the game was any good or not. I like the experimental edge one finds in true indie games, whether that be computer games or tabletop games. I, however, loathe the politicization and the way promoting many of these games seems to come down to spitting on the things that other people love. Being independent should mean just that, not exchanging a set of commercial restrictions for an even harsher set of political demands. The point of being indie should be just that, to be independent and free. Pseudo-academia. We've talked earlier about how social science is barely worthy of the name science, its issues with peer review, reproducibility, and so forth. To quote Peter Bishop, it's not even science. How then would it get its fingers into games culture? Many of these pseudo-academics don't appear to be gamers or involved in game culture in any meaningful way, yet they make pronouncements and are parroted by the games media. How and why? Those that are gamers don't seem to be being objective, and appear to be involved only so far as they want to wreck everything that exists, not to make anything new. Games still aren't a particularly prestigious arena to study, but as money in the games industry increases and its social importance increases, it has become more attractive to academics. They appear to be trying to subject games to the same kinds of examination they have with other cultural artifacts, using postmodernism and critical theory. This has had questionable value in other areas where it has been applied, but the uniquely interactive nature of games makes it even more worthless than usual. Further, it is not only a method and means to supposedly examine and understand society and media, but to actively try and change it. It's an invitation to meddle, to mess, to destroy, to try and censor and control creative people. Pseudo-academic groups like Digra drive a lot of this absurdity. They produce mountains of mostly spurious analysis and navel-gazing that is either impenetrably opaque, breathtakingly absurd, or manifestly ill-informed to all but the most casual of gamers. Nonetheless, it provides article fodder for games media sites, and many of the humanities and journalism graduates now working as games journalists have been through similar propaganda mills. Unsurprisingly, they come out with similar ideas and a similar impetus to change the world. Perhaps they resent that they've ended up writing about Mario and console themselves, no pun intended, that they can make the world a better place by writing a feminist perspective on Princess Peach. Their audience couldn't give a tuppenny toss about the cis-normative heteropatriarchal coding found within Street Fighter and its implications with regard to the female-identified interpretation of Asian American history, and laugh at anyone who does. Their audience, however, seems to be their peers, not their customers. This pseudo-academia does lend a thin veneer of respectability to the people who apparently want to destroy the things they're supposed to be reporting on, and causes the mainstream media to take their assertions seriously. They don't know any better. Let's be clear here, however. This isn't anti-intellectualism on my part. If anything, it's the opposite. Most gamers have great respect for science and technology, but the reasons social sciences are seen as second or third class by other fields are also the reasons many gamers don't take the social sciences seriously. It's their intellectual failings, their lack of adherence to proper method and objectivity that fuels objections, not inverse snobbery. Gamergate's place in this narrative. So, where does Gamergate fit into all this? I've gone to great pains to explain the history of the persecution and misunderstanding of subcultural media, to show that this is nothing new. Gamergate is part of a long tradition of these subcultures fighting back with humour, counter-narratives, and ironic adoption of the insults hurled at them. Geek media, subcultural media, has a justified siege mentality. Video games in particular have constantly been under assault over one thing or another since the 1970s and 80s. These attacks have been consistent, whether it's about addiction, violence, Satanism, or in the latest incarnation of the panic, sexism, racism, diversity and representation. Gamers have been used to it, have fought back against it each time, and it is that, coupled with the holier-than-thou turning out to have feet of clay, that made Gamergate erupt so forcefully and viciously. You have to understand the context to understand the outrage and vehemence. Properly understood, Gamergate was a community coming together to defend their hobby and art form. It was a protest against creeping corruption and nepotism in a business that only gets bigger, grander, and more ambitious year by year. Some will dismiss games still as childish, but as a business it now makes twice as much as the movie industry's box office receipts, and has since 2013. Games have been attacked nearly since their inception. Games are big business. Games are art. People are passionate about their games. None of what has happened should be surprising. What's different about Gamergate? While Gamergate fits into this continuum of moral panics and communities coming together against interlopers and attackers, there is something different about the situation around Gamergate. This also applies to the newer moral panics afflicting tabletop games, nerd movies, comics, and other geek media. In previous panics, the judgments and problems came from outside. There were agenda-driven campaigners, people who knew nothing about the mediums involved. There were glory-seeking pseudoscientists, people driven by personal tragedy, governments seeking more control, moral busybodies and religious groups looking to impose their beliefs and to demonize the other. This time, the attacks have come from within. Where with the violence issues and Jack Thompson, the industry, games media and fans came together to reject the attacks in an almost entirely united front, this time people are divided. The attacks are coming from the hobby's media outlets and websites. There are people embedded within companies trying to force these agendas of censorship and diversity box-ticking exercises. There are regionalization experts failing to do their jobs and instead injecting their politics into the material they're entrusted with. The games media itself is either metaphorically in bed with and corrupted by large games companies, or literally in bed with and corrupted by indie games companies. Where previous battles were against invading outsiders, Gamergate and other more recent wrangles in other nerd media are civil wars, and all the more bitter for it. This is the part that has been so personally devastating to me with regard to Gamergate, perhaps even more so than all the people credulously, and without even the slightest thought, buying into the harassment and misogyny narratives. I'm a creator, an author, a game designer. I work with artists, writers, editors, designers, people at all levels of the creative process. In the past, I've seen them come together to tell censors and authoritarians to piss off. I've seen them fight to defend their art from interference, and the art of others from interference, even things that they hated or disagreed with. This time, though? This time there's buy-in from people in the creative community, and they have used their influence and power to marginalize people they don't like or don't agree with. Accusations have been hurled, boycotts supported, whole groups of people have been banned from fora or put on a block or blacklists. For what? Entirely subjective interpretations of what constitutes some transgression of a mercurial set of standards which are rooted in postmodern relativity anyway and as insubstantial as shifting sand. I had perhaps foolishly thought that based on past behaviour, creative communities shared my devotion to free expression. Discovering that this has changed has been genuinely, shatteringly depressing. It's been called misogynistic, racist, a hate group, reactionary. It's been blamed for Trump, for keeping women out of games and technology. None of this is true. If you want the real story, then you need to buy Inside Gamergate.